Contagious. Well, let's start with how the temperature is detected and how the information is then passed to the center for control. We humans can perceive different gradations of cold and heat, progressing from freezing cold to cool to indifferent to warm to hot and to burning hot. These thermal gradations are discriminated by at least three types of sensory receptors, which are cold receptors, warmth receptors, and then there are also pain receptors. Why am I dragging these pain receptors in this? Because, my dear, these pain receptors, they are also stimulated, but only by the extreme degrees of heat or cold. Now, let's get into the depth of these thermal receptors. First, go with their location, then their pattern of distribution, and finally, we will have a peek at how they work. Except that we won't stop there. Instead, we will learn that which nerves they carry the thermal messages to the ultimate center and by taking which route. So, about the location of these thermal receptors, cold and warmth receptors, they are located immediately under the skin at discrete but separated points, and each point, it has a stimulatory diameter of around 1 millimeter. Mm, as far as distribution is concerned, in most areas of body, there are 3 to 10 times as many cold receptors as warmth receptors, and number in different areas of the body, it varies from 15 to 25 cold points per square centimeter in lips to 3 to 5 in fingers, while less than 1 cold point per square centimeter in some broad surface areas of trunk. And my students, you should not forget that there are correspondingly fewer number of warmth points. Now, the question is that how these thermal receptors, they work and how they are stimulated. You see that cold and warmth receptors, they are stimulated by changes in their metabolic rates, because temperature alters the rates of intercellular chemical reactions more than twofold for each 10 degrees centigrade change. Although it is difficult to judge the gradations of temperature when small areas of surface are stimulated, but when a large area of body is stimulated all at once, these thermal signals from the entire area, they summate. Now the next question is that how these thermal signals, they are carried. So I tell you that the warmth signals, they are received by free nerve endings, and they are transmitted by type C nerve fibers at the rate of 0.4 to 2 meter per second. While the cold signals, they are transmitted via A delta nerve fibers at the rate of 20 meter per second. Now, there are some cold sensations which are also transmitted in type C nerve fibers. Anyway, all these afferents, they finally reach the hypothalamus through the spinothalamic tract. And by saying that, we will jump to the pathway for the temperature signals. Interestingly, the thermal signals, they are transmitted in almost parallel but not exactly the same pathways as the pain signals. So what happens that on entering the spinal cord, these thermal signals, they travel for few segments upward and downward, and then they terminate in the laminae 1, 2 and 3 of the dorsal horns. Then after some processing, these signals, they enter the ascending thermal fibers which cross to the opposite anterolateral sensory tract, and then they terminate in both the reticular areas of brainstem and the ventrobasal complex of the thalamus. And since they terminate in these reticular areas, you must know that these reticular areas, they are involved with the alertness and also with the sleep of a person. So that's why one cannot sleep in extremes of temperature. uh, Apart from the thalamus, some thermal signals, they are also relayed to the somatosensory cortex from the ventrobasal complex and ultimately into the hypothalamus. So you can see that this is how the thermal messages, they are sent from the detectors to the ultimate center of hypothalamus. So far, you have covered that how the changes in the temperature, they are detected by the detectors, and how the messages of the thermal change, they are carried to the center, which nerves carry these signals to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, now have a look at this picture. This hypothalamus, it ultimately receive signals from both the peripheral and the central receptors. The peripheral thermoceptors, they are responsible for detecting any change in the skin temperature or the atmospheric ambient temperature, while the central thermoceptors, they analyze the core body temperature. So when the signals, they reach the hypothalamus takes appropriate actions and send orders to the effector organs, and these effector organs include the adrenal medulla, which releases epinephrine to increase the metabolic rate and hence increase the heat production. The other effectors, they include the sweat glands, because the evaporation of sweat, that produces cooling of skin. Then come the skin arterioles, which are responsible for altering the pattern of cutaneous circulation according to body's need, whether it needs to get rid of heat or conserve heat. And finally come the skeletal muscles as effectors, which can be controlled involuntarily in case of shivering by the hypothalamus, or these act as effectors, and they can produce heat by voluntary exercise on the orders from the cerebral cortex, which constitutes the behavioral aspect of the thermal responses in face to the thermal changes. You see, the effectors are adrenal medulla, sweat glands, skin circulation, and the skeletal muscles. But the question is that how do these effectors they bring about a change in the body temperature, or how do they make the body capable coping with the changes in the ambient temperature? So there are some mechanisms for decreasing or increasing the body temperature. We will have a look at these mechanisms one by one. First, we start with the temperature decreasing mechanisms. These mechanisms they get activated when the temperature of the body is too high and body has to lose heat. And these mechanisms they include vasodilation of blood vessels, sweating, and a decrease in the heat production. Now, the vasodilation of the blood vessels, this is brought about by the inhibition of the sympathetic centers which are present in the posterior hypothalamus. And as I already told you, the sweating it produces cooling by evaporation. Now, the heat production is decreased because there is no shivering, and also because there is a decreased chemical thermogenesis. And it has also been observed that a slight increase in the respiratory rate it also acts as a temperature decreasing mechanism. Now, what are the mechanisms which can increase the body temperature when the body is too cold? The temperature control mechanisms they get activated like vasoconstriction, piloerection, and the thermogenesis. This vasoconstriction it is caused by the stimulation of posterior hypothalamic sympathetic center. And as far as piloerection is concerned, you all know that it causes hair to stand upright and trap an insulated layer of air next to the body to conserve heat. Now, how thermogenesis, which is heat production, how this heat production is increased in this scenario? That is achieved by three factors by inducing shivering and by increasing sympathetic activation and also by an increase in the secretion of thyroxine. Let me give you a little detail about thermogenesis, which could be mechanical as well as chemical. Mechanical thermogenesis it mainly constitutes shivering, while the chemical thermogenesis it could be short term or it could be long term heat production. Short term chemical thermogenesis it consists of sympathetic chemical excitation, while the long term heat production that results from increased thyroxine production. Now, here comes your university question about the mechanical thermogenesis, which mainly is shivering. We will look at the mechanism which is responsible for shivering. Primary motor center for shivering is located in the dorsomedial portion of posterior hypothalamus, and this area usually it is kept inhibited by the signals from the heat centers in the anterior hypothalamus, and it is excited by the cold signals which could come from skin or from spinal cord. So when these cold signals they arise, they excite the primary motor center for shivering, which send the orders or the signals through the bilateral tracts down the brainstem and then through the lateral column of spinal cord to the anterior motor neurons. So when these anterior motor neurons they are excited, increased muscle tone that results due to the overactivity of these anterior motor neurons. So you can say that shivering it starts as a result of feedback oscillations of muscle spindles stretch reflex mechanism. So that was the mechanical thermogenesis. Now, moving on to the chemical thermogenesis, and as I already told you that it could be short term or long term, the short term chemical thermogenesis that basically is due to the high cellular metabolism. You see that the activation of sympathetic system and the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine that is responsible for the excessive metabolism, because this epinephrine and norepinephrine they are responsible to uncouple the oxidative phosphorylation, which will lead to heat production but no ATP generation. Well, don't get your hopes very high, because this phenomenon that is only more pronounced in animals having brown fat. As far as the humans are concerned, in adults, only 10 to 15% increase in the heat production that occurs by the chemical thermogenesis. But in children, the heat production it can increase up to 100%. Here we were talking about the short-term thermogenesis. So the long-term chemical thermogenesis that is achieved by thyroxine. What happens that when anterior hypothalamus it is cooled down, this cooling it results in the release of thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which will result in the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Now, the release of this TSH from the anterior pituitary that results in the thyroxine release by the thyroid gland, which will cause increased cellular metabolism and hence the heat production. But keep in mind that this mechanism it requires months to develop, and it is evident after prolonged exposure to cold. And once again, it is more pronounced in animals and Inuits. Now the question is that what role our hypothalamus plays in thermoregulation, and the answer is very crucial, as our hypothalamus it houses a heat center and a cold center. The heat center is basically the anterior hypothalamic preoptic area. Our anterior hypothalamus it has not only large number of heat sensitive neurons, but it also has around one third cold sensitive neurons. Now the heat sensitive neurons they increase their firing rate 2 to 10 fold in response to a 10 degree centigrade rise in body temperature. So you can say that the hypothalamic preoptic area, it serves as a thermostat for the body, because when a hypothalamic preoptic area is heated, there are certain changes which take place, such as there is profuse sweating all over the body, and we see intense vasodilation, and also heat production is decreased. Now, there is another question that how do our skin and deep tissue receptors, they play their role in the hypothalamic thermoregulation? Um, you should know that skin contains 10 times more cold receptors as compared to the warmth receptors. And peripheral temperature detection, that is primarily responsible for cold detection. So when the skin receptors, they are cooled, the reflexes, they try to increase the body temperature and conserve heat immediately by causing shivering and by inhibiting the sweat formation and by promoting skin vasoconstriction. So what do the deep receptors they do? Now you see these deep receptors, they are present in the spinal cord, near the deep viscera and around great veins. Now these deep tissue receptors, they are responsible for detecting core body temperature. And keep in mind that both the skin and the deep tissue receptors, they are responsible for preventing hypothermia. All types of receptors, they function by showing a transient change in the receptor potential. Now, the cold center, that is located in the posterior hypothalamus. You see, the posterior hypothalamus, that is also important because it integrates the central and the peripheral temperature sensory signals. Now, this special area that is located in the posterior hypothalamus bilaterally near the mammillary body. Signals from the anterior hypothalamic preoptic area and elsewhere in the body, they are integrated in the posterior hypothalamic area to activate the heat producing and heat conserving reactions of the body. Now, in order to understand that how our hypothalamus, it uh, plays a major role in the thermoregulation, you can have a look at this flowchart, which should suffice the answer that how hypothalamus is involved in thermoregulation. You can see that in cold conditions, our posterior hypothalamus, that is stimulated, and it brings about certain changes such as the sympathetic center stimulation and the shivering center stimulation, and ultimately through different effectors, uh, certain mechanisms, they are started which ultimately result in less heat loss and more heat production, which will finally increase the body temperature in cold conditions. And exactly opposite reactions, they take place when our anterior hypothalamus, that is stimulated by excessive temperature, and at the same time the posterior hypothalamus, it integrates all these signals, and this is how hypothalamus, it controls thermoregulation. Here I would like my DPG students also to wake up, as this part could constitute one of their university questions. In a cool or moderate environment, heat production during exercise is directly proportional to exercise intensity, and venous blood, draining the exercising muscles distributes the excess heat throughout the body core. However, uh, the method of heat loss during continuous exercise is modified according to the ambient conditions. Now, you should keep in mind that any heat produced by the working muscles and is not lost, it must be stored in body tissues. It means that body heat gain during exercise will be equal to the heat produced minus the heat loss. Moreover, exercise using large muscle groups, for example, that of legs, it can result in large amounts of heat production. Uh, and we can say that the increase in body temperature during exercise, it depends not only on the body weight or the mass, but also on the specific heat of body tissues. Now, there is another term which you should be familiar with, and it's called heat index. Now, what is heat index? It is the measure of body's perception of how hot it feels. This heat index is calculated by combining the air temperature and the relative humidity to compute an apparent temperature. For example, if air temperature is 82 degree Fahrenheit and humidity is 80%, then the heat index it will be around 89 degree Fahrenheit. It means that high humidity it increases an individual's perception of how hot the environment feels. Now, I will introduce you to a very important concept of set point for temperature control. The body core temperature is maintained at 37.1 degree centigrade or 98.8 degree Fahrenheit. This temperature is called the set point of temperature control system. So, what happens when the body temperature it fluctuates from set point? You see, if the body temperature rises above the set point, all the heat losing mechanisms they come into play, and if the body temperature falls below this point, then all the heat conserving and heat generating mechanisms they are activated. Here is a list of thermal responses of our body in case the body temperature it fluctuates from the set point. You can see that if the body's temperature it rises above the set point and our body has to lose heat, then there are certain mechanisms through which it loses heat, such as perspiration, vasodilation, and the relaxation of the erector pili muscle. Even the metabolism is reduced. Similarly, when the body temperature falls below the set point and the body has to gain the temperature, then there are mechanisms for the heat generation, such as shivering and vasoconstriction. The metabolism is quite increased. The contraction of the erector pili muscle to trap a thin layer of air around the body. Now, here I have skipped certain things such as the stretching out or increased appetite, and to gain heat, there is curling up and there is reduced appetite. So, why did I skip these? Because these constitute the behavioral adaptation to control the body temperature. You see, the psychic sensations of being overheated or being too cold, they are also sent to the person at the same time. So, if overheated, the person moves to a cold room and takes cold drinks and prefer light cotton clothing. Similarly, these sprawling or seeking shade kind of movements, they are included into the behavioral control for the body temperature. Say if a person, if the atmosphere it is too cold, then the person assumes appropriate adjustments like moving to a warm room, and he or she takes hot drinks and prefers the insulating clothes. And you should not skip these behavioral adaptation while answering the question also. To the list of the things which you shouldn't forget is the local skin reflexes also, because these overall local skin reflexes, they almost equate the hypothalamic heat control, because these local signals, they strengthen this control system. Now, how do they work? These local cord reflexes, they are involved in carrying impulses from the local skin receptors to the spinal cord and then taking them back to the same skin area and its sweat glands. Now, these reflexes, they include local vasoconstriction or local vasodilation and sweating. And you can conclude the importance of these local reflexes from the fact that the body temperature control mechanism, it is lost if the spinal cord is severed in the neck above the sympathetic outflow from the cord. Deputy students to wake up, it doesn't mean the rest of you could hit snooze, because here again is another important topic. Um, Yet another university question, that how do we acclimatize to hot or cold environments? So first, we will have a look at the heat acclimatization and the mechanisms a human body adopts for acclimatizing, getting used to of the hot conditions. There are several mechanisms by which a person's ability to tolerate heat is improved, who have been living in hot climate for long times. The main mechanisms of acclimatization to heat are more sweating and more vasopressin, and the conservation of salts. Um, when exposed to high temperature, an acclimatized person sweats more heavily, up to 4 liter per hour, as against to around 1.5 liter per hour only in unacclimatized person. How this conservation of salts takes place? You see, when there is excessive sweating in an unacclimatized person, that will lead to hyponatremia due to the loss of the salts, the sodium chloride in the sweat. And because of that hyponatremia, there will be greater secretion of aldosterone. And this hormone, because of this hormone, the salt content of sweat and urine, it decreases remarkably in an acclimatized person. Now, the another change to acclimatize to the hot conditions is excessive release of vasopressin. And because of this secretion, renal blood flow is decreased, and ultimately the urinary volume, it is also decreased to conserve water. There has also been observed some dilation of cutaneous blood vessels as an acclimatizing method. Even total blood volume, it may also decrease. Now we move on to the